So next, let's see how we would use the IHttp action result. Let's open up our new stats controller and use it as an example. So here in this get, we're returning an HTTP response message and then constructing one from the request. And this is a lot of glue code that we have to think about. Certainly we could just return the object without using HTTP response message, but if we needed to deal with error conditions or failures, we couldn't really do that easily. So instead, let's pass back HTTP action result. And in that case, instead of create response, we're simply going to call OK. We're going to say return the HTTP action result that will return OK as the status code and take this content and serialize it to the user. If we do the same thing here, then again, these become OK, which is nice and simple, right? It's a little cleaner about what we're actually doing. And then instead of returning response with not found, we can simply say not found. And so the result of the design and the implementation of our methods on our controllers ends up being a lot clearer and a lot more self-describing. And I'll repeat that here. Most of the kinds of standard status codes you're used to returning are going to be included here. So we could certainly do not found, but we also could do bad request, internal server error, etc. So there's a number of these. You're going to want to look at the documentation to see all of the different IHttP action results that you can return directly because we're using the API controller. But where could we use this IHttP action result in our own code? The idea behind its use is not only that we want to return and truncate our code here so that we're a little clear about what we're doing, but we also want control over constructing the response message. And so it may be that you want to be able to send certain things. And a common case of this is either you want to control serialization or you want to control headers that are sent back. And instead of repeating that code over and over and over again, we can actually create one of these IHttP action results that will package that up in a pretty simple way. Let's do that. I'm going to start by creating a new folder because we may have a handful of these results. So I'm going to create an action result folder for us to hold these individual action results in. And I'll add a new class here, and I'm going to call this versioned action result. And I'm going to derive this from IHttP action result, which is in system.web.http. I'm also going to implement the interface so that I can actually see what we're doing here. And I'm going to clean up the code by importing some namespaces because it makes me crazy that it doesn't do this for me. So that we have our task that goes and executes in order to return us an HTTP response message. So we're going to want a constructor here because we're going to need some pieces of information for our versioned results, right? We're probably going to need an HTTP request message. We're also going to need a string that represents the version that we want to add onto the response message. And we're finally going to probably want some body that we're going to send back that will be versioned, right? And because of this, we're actually, in my case, we're going to use a generic version of this class where T is some object. So it's going to be a class, and I'm going to allow it to be passed in to our versioned result. And then I'll go ahead and very quickly store these locally. And so there we simply have our constructor and the three pieces of information we need to actually implement calling and constructing our response message. So to implement this, we're simply going to take the request and call create response using the body as the content of that response. So that we're creating the response message we want to send back with the body content of what we want it to actually serialize. And here is where we're going to do our special piece of code. We're going to go ahead and add some specialized header. We don't really have a use for this, but this is to show you what's really going on. And we're going to pass in that version that was being given to us from the constructor. And then we're going to use task from result to tell it to return a task with some body content. In this case, we're doing this pretty synchronously, but the interface requires it to look and pass back a task. So we're going to go ahead and allow that by just task from result. Sometimes this is going to be an operation that is asynchronous, and so you could certainly use async and await in order to do this. Now that we have the result, what do we do with it? Let's go over to our base controller and let's add support. I like doing it here, that way we don't have to pass in too many pieces from our code. We want our code to be nice and clean. So in order to allow this, we're going to create a new protected call that's going to return an HTTP action result. And this is just going to be something that's going to allow the controllers themselves to call this. And I'm just going to say versioned. And here we're going to allow them to pass in a generic version of the content they want to send and then the version. Now in our case, we're going to default it to be version v1. So they only need to specify it if they want to override that version. And returning this is simply just saying return new versioned action result. And we just need to tell it that this is a class for our generic argument here. And then we're just going to simply return a new instance of our action result by passing in our request, which we already have access to, the version, and then the body. Let's make sure it's using the generic version, bring in the action results namespace, and now we've added this to our base API so that we can now, anywhere we need to return a version header, let's say in foods, instead of returning a food model, we can go ahead and return an HTTP action result, and then simply wrap this in versioned. And in this way, your individual methods on your controllers won't need to think about manipulating the headers individually. Let's make sure it's built. And if we head over to Fiddler, we have our call to an individual food. Let's execute that. And we'll see that it returned to 200. If we look at the result, the raw result, we'll see right here is our version at v1. If we come back here and change that version, again, this is allowing us to just pass in whatever version information we want, and we re-execute this call, we're going to see we now have our version 2 as that header being injected in. So the result of this is that we're able to add a very simple way using IHttpActionResult, way to wrap this common functionality that you may need throughout your Web API solution in order to do things like manipulate the data types that are being returned, manipulate the way the formatters work, or ultimately be able to change the headers as well. Let's wrap up this module.